700 megawatt bidirectional submarine electrical power transmission cable. What that means, it's that there's going to be a cable that goes from Puerto Rico to DR in order to supply energy now. 700 megawatts is a lot, right? Just for context, 1 megawatt could power about 750 homes. So you can do the math on that one. And joining him is Tirso Selman. He's also a business development executive, and he's also working with Caribbean Transmission Development Company in connecting Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic by 2030. And lastly, we have Eduardo Bhatia. He's one of the few politicians I actually like. And he served as president of the Senate from 2013 to 2017. Fiscal matters, private, public, and he's also a current visiting professor at Princeton. So please, a big round of applause, and let's listen and learn a little bit about island interconnection as our foundation for energy resilience.
Getting started, I guess. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us. Good morning, buenos dias. Again, my name is Francisco Cerezo. I'm a partner at DLA Piper. I chair our Latin America practice. I'm particularly pleased to be here with all of you. Known Rafael for many years, Eduardo and Tirso. And this is a really fascinating project. And on the margins of everything we're talking about here, whether it's aerospace or other economic development for Puerto Rico, one thing we can all agree is that Puerto Rico really needs to transform. It's a process that's currently ongoing, and improve, its energy offering. The cost of energy is way too high in Puerto Rico. And also, there's been a number of challenges. We're not going to go there. But clearly, for the long-term economic well-being and prosperity of Puerto Rico, energy is at the centerpiece of all of that. So this is a really exciting project. There's similar projects globally that have been done successfully, and there's been a lot of discussion over the years of the possibility of connecting Puerto Rico through a high voltage submarine cable. But now this group here, certainly Rafael and Tirso, who's part of that effort, are hopefully bringing it to fruition. So that's the purpose of today's discussion, to get a better sense of the project, its inception, viability, and what the prospects are for it. It's getting a lot of attention in the media, but it's for good reason, because a lot of people are looking at it and seeing it as a tremendously viable. It's going to have some challenges, but it's challenges that could certainly be addressed, and hopefully sooner rather than later we'll have this high voltage submarine cable connecting Dominican Republic to Puerto Rico. So with that, let's start with Eduardo. To refer to Eduardo as a politician, I don't think does him service. He's actually transitioned. He was a terrific public servant. He was a president of the Senate. He's now an academic. So he's left retail politics aside. He's now an academic at Princeton, no less, but remains very committed to the island, shuttling between here and New Jersey. And you were instrumental in all of what we're calling the energy transformation in Puerto Rico, something that's been discussed now for decades. But when you were in office as president of the Senate, you were one of the key players in enacting the Law 17 in particular, which really kicked off the transformation of Puerto Rico. We've seen it now. There was obviously the PREPA transformation that now has Luma, Genera, but it has a million other components. And this is still only in diapers. This is another step in what we will call the energy transformation of Puerto Rico for long-term economic prosperity. So can you talk a little bit about, as one of the co-authors of Law 17, how you see this project, how it aligns with the strategic priorities of Law 17?
Thank you, Francisco, and great to be here with you, with Rafael, with Tirso. Wonderful people, wonderful thinkers, and thank you all for being here. I would just say, in terms of where we were, just briefly, one sentence. Puerto Rico for 70, 75 years had a state-owned monopoly when it came to energy. And it was a very inefficient monopoly. Things were not going well. And the one thing we had to do was break up that state-owned monopoly and open a market. And it was not easy. It was really hard. We can leave that for another forum, just to tell you how many scars I have from that fight. But it's actually happening. And one thing we knew we had to do at the same time was not only break up the state-owned monopoly and open a market, but also move to renewable energy. And that was sort of our main focus when we decided to do this. Act 17 has many things. It has a regulator, but it basically creates a system under which we can open a market. And that market should not be just within Puerto Rico. And that's where the cable comes in. So I think we are following the so-called book of Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat. We realized we should break up with insularismo, as we say in Puerto Rico. And we decided that this cable, for example, can actually add so much redundancy to Puerto Rico. It can add so much in terms of A, renewable energy, B, when Puerto Rico goes in trouble for generation, we can see that happening. And number three, I think the cable opens up an opportunity to go both ways. The cable should not, it's starting with the Dominican Republic. It should not stop there. I think, the whole idea of an inter-island connection would be a great idea for developing any of the great thoughts we're having here today. I'll finish with this. In terms of that first, there are so many issues that we still have to face, but energy consumption in Puerto Rico will increase dramatically over the course of the next 15 to 20 years. And that's because of AI, that's because of onshoring, that's because of the expansion of biotech companies. You would be surprised at how many, I'm not at liberty because I'm not the Secretary of Economic Development, I'm not at liberty to tell you how many biotech companies are going to be announcing over the course of the next year expansions, huge expansions in Puerto Rico. And that will need more energy. Electric vehicles, we will be moving into electric vehicles. If you add all of that, you will see that there will be a huge demand. The question is, can the generation meet up? And I think that's where the cable and other cables should be able to supply that energy. And I think it's a great idea, therefore.
So, Rafael, before we actually, because I have a lot of questions to get really granular, but I think it's actually worth taking one step back. Could you just sketch out the four corners of what Project Hostos is? Because before we start talking about how this is good for Puerto Rico and some of the technical aspects and the economic, engineering, technical feasibility, viability, let's take two steps back. And if you could just sketch out what is Project Hostos, what would it look like, where would it connect from, to, et cetera?
Sure. Well, the project, as many other projects in the world, it interconnects two countries. In Europe, all the countries are basically interconnected. The United States is actually interconnected with Canada and Mexico. And the thing here in Puerto Rico is that we are not. We're an island, and all the other islands have been closed off in terms of interconnection, no? So basically, it's a two-way, bidirectional, high-voltage direct current cable between the Dominican Republic, and it connects the national grid of the Dominican Republic at San Pedro de Macorís, all the way to Punta Cana. It goes subsea in Punta Cana at basically a maximum depth of 499 meters. And then it connects into Mayagüez through the port of Mayagüez using horizontal drilling. And it goes through the port and then underground all the way to the substation in Mayagüez. The cable per se, it's DC, direct current. The grids, obviously, they work in AC. So there has to be a converter station in the DR that converts from AC to DC and then back from DC to AC to connect to the grid in Puerto Rico. And that's very important. It connects actually to the main line, let's say, the spinal cord of the electrical grid in both countries, in the DR and in Puerto Rico as well.
So if you could maybe expand a little bit, I know this is, labor of love for you, but it's also, it's one of these examples where you could do well by doing good. I mean, obviously this can ultimately be a tremendous project and be very financially successful, but if you could speak a little bit as, I know you've been in the energy industry, you've been private equity, you were involved with a very successful energy company in Latin America in years past, but if you could speak to, how the idea came to be and what your thoughts on how this will add and enhance the resiliency aspect of energy in Puerto Rico.
Definitely. Well, first of all, the idea was not mine. I mean, it's been an idea that's been going on since the 70s and 80s. Actually, I found a newspaper article from February 17, 1987, where the governor of Puerto Rico, Rafael Hernández Colón, met with the president of the Dominican Republic, Joaquín Balaguer, talking about the interconnection. Back then, obviously, Puerto Rico had an overcapacity, and they were willing to sell that to the Dominican Republic. Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, actually, she pushed forward an initiative to interconnect the entire Caribbean. How they thought about it was actually starting interconnecting Puerto Rico with USVI, thinking that because both of them are U.S. territories, it will be easier. Nevertheless, it was actually more difficult. The USVI, the consumption of energy is very small. It's not enough to actually justify the investment on the cable. And what we think is actually should start with the two biggest economies in the Caribbean. I think eventually the whole Caribbean will be interconnected as it is in telecommunications. As you guys know, the world is totally interconnected when it comes to telecommunications. The first subsea cable for telecommunications came about 100 years before the electrical one. So hopefully what we'll see in the future is a world totally interconnected, where you could have energy, solar energy being produced in the Sahara, given to, let's say, New York when it's nighttime in New York. In terms of the benefits, Francisco, definitely resiliency is the main benefit. There will be others, such as cost savings, but resiliency should be the main one. When a hurricane hits Tampa or hits New Orleans, those grids are able to actually get up pretty quickly because they're interconnected. When you get the freeze in Texas, for example, it took a while for them to actually get back up on their system because they're not interconnected. So the same thing happens to the islands, In Puerto Rico, we are limited to 100 miles times 35. With this cable, it'll give us access to 5 times more land, which is cheaper than we have right now. When we're talking about energy projects, utility scale solar projects here in Puerto Rico, they compete with the farmland. In having access to the Dominican Republic, we'll have access to marginal land that it won't compete with the farmland. So it has a lot of benefits in that sense.
So Tirso Selman, so you're a lifelong energy industry executive. You've held a number of roles with energy companies, global and regional, but with a particular focus in the Americas and certainly Latin America. When a project like this comes up, people start thinking, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And of course, people immediately start saying, well, there's going to be this challenge, that challenge. I know you're now working with Rafael on the project, you're project director for Hostos. Can you speak to some of the lessons learned in other markets, other jurisdictions where you've been involved with complex energy projects and some of the lessons learned that you're then applying to make this project come to fruition successfully?
Of course, thank you. The biggest lesson learned is that we have to have the willingness and support of the country where we're working. Puerto Rico is in an energy transition now, and it is focused on where it wants to be in 20 years from now. It's designing what it wants to be. But one thing that we must keep in mind is that economies can't grow in the dark. We need a reliable, resilient grid in order to grow. So transition without resiliency is not a valid or is not a effective transition. What we think the cable will bring to the table is that resiliency and that Puerto Rico needs to be able to achieve its goals. Dominican Republic began its transformation of its electrical system over 20 years ago, so they are ahead of us, and we see how they've improved their situation considerably through significant investment in renewables, significant investment primarily in a smart grid. Puerto Rico needs to catch up, but today, and that's a big question that you get when you speak to people that are not necessary, that are in their day-to-day lives not involved in these type of projects. They see that Dominican Republic still has issues. So Dominican Republic will be benefited by reliability from an interconnection, just as Puerto Rico will. And Puerto Rico will catch up in its energy transition. But interconnection, as Rafael was mentioning, will facilitate that transition, will bring that reliability that will allow that transition. That requires a support, that requires guidance and direction from decision makers. It requires commitment.
So it's really interesting. I mean, when you were speaking, Rafael, that 30-odd something years ago, it was discussions with Rafael Hernandez Colon of Puerto Rico being the one that could help Balaguer with its energy issues, and now things have flipped, right? The script has somewhat flipped. Is there, in what you're seeing in the Dominican Republic, Tirso, is there great appetite for this, both the business community on the government level, from the private and public sector in the Dominican Republic? Is there excitement for the project?
Definitely,
what are you seeing?
definitely. The Dominican president announced their support for the project recently in Washington, D.C. at a financial conference led by the Financial Times. We see a significant number of power generation developers who have expressed interest and willingness to support a Puerto Rico power generation project. So, and today, Dominican Republic is one of the most attractive markets for investors in terms of power generation. Now, we want Puerto Rico as well to be one of those, but you have to have a stable system. You have to have a resilient system for those investors to come in. It's critical to have a streamlined process of permits and stuff like that. That, I think, has been the key that has led to Dominican Republic's growth in attracting investment in energy. I think that Puerto Rico will get there. I think that Dominican Republic's interconnection, in line with what Rafael was saying, is going to be the complement that we need.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Dominican Republic, and I've been doing work in the DR for decades, and it was essentially a conditioned precedent to get their house in order from an energy perspective. Everyone points to the tourism industry, how it's blown up, and you see Punta Cana, and I know people in Puerto Rico look at Punta Cana, and it's like, why not us? And you see these mega developments, and you see manufacturing boom, but it was a conditioned precedent to all of that to really get their energy issues taken care of. And it's a lesson for Puerto Rico in that regard, how being able to address these really critical energy issues really is a conditioned precedent to all the other economic development. But speaking of economic development, Rafael, and before we get more on the policy aspects with Eduardo, you come from the financial sector, private equity and whatnot, and I'm sure there's folks like you from that background in the room. And we get it, resiliency, it's important, but just let's talk dollars and cents. What are the economic benefits for people looking at Puerto Rico as, from the private sector, investors in Puerto Rico? What are the economic benefits that a project like Project Hostos would create for Puerto Rico, would inure for the benefit of Puerto Rico?
Well, I would like to state saying that the main theme of this conference is economic development, right? And you cannot have economic development if you don't have a stable and cheap energy system. No? It's very hard to actually convince people to come and invest in the island on plans on whatever widget you want to do, if they don't have energy and they have to build their own generation as well. When you look at the Dominican Republic in 2004, their GDP was basically 25% what Puerto Rico's was. Today, the Dominican Republic has 17% more GDP than Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico's GDP has been stagnant since 2004. And part of that development, the main thing of that development, the foundation of that development is energy. And that, I think, will be the main thing of this cable. And again, this is not a silver bullet. This cable is not going to solve all of the problems of the energy system in Puerto Rico. The energy system is quite complex, not as complex as a launch pad to space, but still very complex. And I think given that what we're trying to, this initiative, what it tries to solve is the resiliency issue and tries to bring energy generation from the DR, but at the same time, there's other initiatives that we have to do here. We have to do rooftop solar, we have to do utility scale solar farms, we have to do microgrids. You know, there's a bunch of other initiatives that will actually add up to the entire solution that we need here in Puerto Rico. This cable, we're talking about a $1.2 billion investment, and so far, I mean, and I don't want to say the numbers, but so far, apparently, the returns are amazing, what we're projecting, definitely. But the return, the social economic return, not only to the area of the West Coast, but to the entire island, will be astronomically as well, if the government and the private sector takes part of it, you know, takes initiative and participates in that as well.
So, Eduardo, you were involved in Puerto Rico politics and as a legislature for decades. So you have a lot of visibility into, you know, the policy issues, the regulatory issues. And one of the concerns when people look at a project like this, with all of the complexities we know it has from a federal level, an international law, whether Dominican component, Puerto Rico, U.S. federal and whatnot, but focusing primarily on Puerto Rico regulatory and policy issues. Can you speak to what you see are the challenges, if you will, and how you think they could be addressed or overcome?
Yeah, I tell my students, you know, there's the philosophy and then there's the plumbing. And so let's focus for a second on the plumbing. You get the philosophy, we want to interconnect, we want the energy. The plumbing for Puerto Rico takes two sides, the federal side and the local side. The federal side, of course, it needs a presidential permit. It needs to be evaluated by the Department of Energy and it permits from the Department of Energy. It needs the an environmental assessment to see if the project is actually viable when it comes to environmental issues. And it also needs, I believe, and we're thinking of that, is FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So there are some specific regulatory issues that have to be looked into and that do take time and that do require. However, there are some prior exchanges of energy from Canada and from, as Rafael was saying, and from Mexico that could serve as a good precedents for us to move forward. Now, at the local level, we have since 2014, that was sort of Energy Reform 1.0. Act 17 was like 2.0. We're looking forward to 3.0, but 1.0 introduced in Puerto Rico for the first time the regulator. Puerto Rico never had a regulator. So it not only had a state-owned monopoly, but it never had a regulator. So the state-owned monopoly on energy decided what price it would set and what the conditions were to sell energy. So now we have a regulator called the PREP, Puerto Rico Energy Bureau. We have to go through the PREP. We have to, or the cable has to, the cable proponents have to go through the Environmental Quality Board, do the environmental assessments for Puerto Rico, do the permitting for the interconnection. But again, all of those things are to be placed on a checklist, and I don't think there should be a problem for any of them as long as there's a political will to actually do it. I would add to what Rafael said, I want to echo this. This should not be a threat to the whole process that is taking place right now on Tranche 1, Tranche 2, Tranche 3, in terms of developing solar farms in Puerto Rico. Solar, utility scale solar will happen in Puerto Rico and should happen in Puerto Rico. And in fact, if anyone out there is listening and has anything to do with it, we're 3 years behind from where we should be. I think the demand for energy, I don't have a crystal ball in front of me, the demand of energy is going to be so huge that there will be enough demand for both the local projects that are being developed, for the rooftop solar, for the first ever that we're developing in Puerto Rico. I don't know how many of you know this. Tesla is developing in Puerto Rico the first virtual plant where we're interconnecting all the Tesla batteries at households and actually creating a stability and resiliency out of interconnecting those. So I think there are many things that are coming out of the fact that we deregulated or that we have opened a market. And one of them should be, one of the items, not the only one, and I think Rafael was very clear on that. This is not going to save Puerto Rico. This is going to add one more piece to the puzzle that I think covers utility scale, covers the investments that are taking place on rooftop solar, and covers all of the other new inventions that are coming in through energy. A lot of regulatory issues, yes, and hopefully we will overcome each one of them as we go along.
So, I mean, clearly electrical issues, let's call them, are very top of mind these days here in Puerto Rico, especially during political or silly season in that regard. But, you know, speak to, and I think you partially addressed that already in your answer, but speak to the benefits. How beneficial would this be, even if there weren't all the electrical issues? Because right now it's very top of mind, so people have almost a sense of urgency of how can all of this be addressed. But putting aside, let's assume all these other things were working as they should, and we hope will in due course. Can you speak to the benefits that you still see for a project like this, regardless of the issues that are, you know, front page news these days?
Yeah, regardless of the current blackouts, and if you live in Puerto Rico and you have not experienced a blackout over the course of the last week, you're lucky. You can. We have a prize. I have an award for you. We are having a problem in Puerto Rico when it comes to generation right now. That problem hopefully will be dealt with in the next couple of years, not a couple of months, but a couple of years. The main success of Act 17 was trying to open a market. The main failure, coming from me, main failure of Act 17 was taking the energy discussion out of the political scenario. It is, if you hear the 4 candidates for governor, 20%, 30% of what they're discussing is all energy from a political standpoint, not from a technological, technical, you know, a wise, reasonable standpoint. So I would say having a stable energy system in a moment when we're doing onshoring, in a moment when the United States is spending a lot of its political capital throughout the world to bring back to the United States a lot of companies in China, in India, in Taiwan, that they want to come back to the United States. Puerto Rico having so far, perhaps the 15% will come, but having preferential treatment when it comes to taxes. I think if you put all the pieces together, Puerto Rico with a stable electric system could be the best place to actually come back and bring back the onshoring that the United States wants. So that's how I tie it to something bigger than the current sort of whether you had a blackout or not. It's a bigger picture, and I think it's a long-term vision for being a magnet for the onshoring companies.
And let me add a little bit to that, Francisco. Yeah, you're right. You know, if we had a stable and great grid, the cable will still be viable. I mean, right now you have England is interconnected with France, with Denmark, with Norway. It's not because one of their electrical grids is in a really bad shape, you know. However, given the bad shape that we are, definitely the benefits are going to be a lot better, a lot more, and the viability and particularly the financial viability, it's a lot better as well.
I want to add to that as well. The interconnection will enable and facilitate the transition of Law 17. Today, we know that Genera is struggling to maintain active and operational the power generation assets that exist on the island due to many reasons, but primarily due to lack of maintenance. And every time that a power plant requires maintenance or trips out, it creates a domino effect that takes out a significant amount of users. the benefit of having this power coming from another source will allow those maintenance exercises to provide reliability to the existing assets, but will also accelerate the ability to decommission those old assets and bring in the new assets. Today, we don't have any space to have any hiccups. Furthermore, once our situation here in Puerto Rico is stable, we have an added benefit, a technological benefit that we don't realize, and it is we add an hour of sunlight from going east to west with the sun. So if you have a solar power plant that is in the east coast of Puerto Rico, as the sun moves, you gain an hour of electricity by having a sister plant on the west coast of Dominican Republic. When you multiply 1 megawatt by an hour, when you multiply 100 megawatts by an hour, it's a significant amount of power that is important for the for the cost and the reliability of both systems.
And talking a little bit about that transition, I mean, right now, the average age of the thermal power plants in Puerto Rico is 40 years old. And we're talking about going 100% renewable by 2050. That's 25 years from now. If we don't have access to new thermal power plants, we're going to be relying in 2050 on power plants that are 65 years old. You know, they're up for Social Security benefits already. I think we need to have the capacity to actually have access to new thermal power plants, and this project actually comes, it's accompanied by a new thermal power plant, state of the art in the DR, to be able to supply to Puerto Rico on a first stage basis.
Can I just say that when I was president of the Senate, I don't know if anyone here from Georgia Tech, but a group of students from Georgia Tech showed up in my office, and they wanted to talk about energy and whatnot. And I said, why are you here? Oh, we came to see the thermoelectric plants of Puerto Rico. We can't believe they're still, operational. They are, they wanted to see basically, this was like Jurassic Park. They wanted to see the dinosaurs that are still going on out there. So to an extent, I think part of this whole project is combining itself with a vision that Puerto Rico has to move forward and has to get fresh, good, solid, reliable energy. And I think the cable helps in that process.
So it seems they're public sector, private sector, nonpartisan, bipartisan, multipartisan, whatever you want to call it. There's support both in the Dominican Republic, in Puerto Rico, and in DC. So that's the good news for all of this. So let's now start getting more granular onto the project specifics. What are we talking? I mean, we are now talking about timelines and the need to, with these outdated facilities that we have. What is the timeline on completion of this, and what's driving that timeline? Are we talking, is this something, putting aside the financing and all of that, which I know is moving along, but are we talking this is something to be completed in 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20, what are we looking at?
I mean, the most important thing, Francisco, is that there's a window of opportunity that there's actually political will in Puerto Rico, in the Dominican Republic, and in Washington for this type of project. That I think is the first most. The other one is permitting. Like Eduardo said, we need what is called a U.S. presidential permit. So because the cable crosses the U.S. border, we need that permit, and the President of the United States doesn't actually sign that order. That responsibility is delegated to the Department of Energy, and the Department of Energy has an office called the Grid Deployment Office that deals specifically with this. And there has been some challenges. The good news is this is not the first cable. There's 164 cables that go into the United States, but this is the first one in the Caribbean. This is the first one with the Dominican Republic. There was a restructuring in the Department of Energy. Before, it was the Office of Electricity that used to deal with this type of permits. Now it's the Grid Deployment Office. The guys at the Office of Electricity, they retired, so So for the grid deployment office, it's kind of like a new process as well. So we're dealing with that. We're dealing with the NEPA process, which is the environmental one. And we recently, 2 weeks ago, we had a very good meeting over there in Washington where we established a timeline, and that timeline basically gives us the presidential permit by this time next year. Once we have that, then we actually should hire the equipment companies, the cable and the converter stations, for them to be constructed. The construction of those equipment, and they're specific to each project. This is not like going to Home Depot and buying one of those equipments. So the construction of those equipments take a year. Nevertheless, the next manufacturing slot allocation for the cable and the construction company is probably going to start in 2028. So that's I think will be the bottleneck, the biggest hurdle that we have right now. How do we actually get that manufacturing slot allocation without still getting the presidential permit? I would like to get that before getting the presidential permit, and that way we could actually have this project in what we believe will be January 1st, 2031.
Yeah, Julie, you mentioned earlier about connectivity between the UK and continental Europe. You just now mentioned well over 100 of these cables in the US. Before we get into financing, I don't know if that's Tirso or you, and how we actually get this paid for. We'll address that. That's important. But can you map that out, I think, for the benefit of the audience, to just get a sense, because sometimes people see these things a little bit like science fiction. You're going to connect a high voltage cable, but this has been happening now for decades, and there's a number of them. But when you mention 100 and something in the US alone, could you map out globally what these projects look like? How many are there? How successful they have been, maybe just for a little bit of context for our audience?
Sure. There's over 300 interconnection cables that connect different countries. This is particularly in Europe and in Asia. Of those 350 are subsea. And just to give you a context, the UK has 9 interconnection cables coming out of that island, no? And there's other projects going into the UK, for example, from Morocco all the way to the UK. There's this type of project in Southeast Asia and Australia. There's a project going from Australia to Indonesia, connecting those. And there's cables right now connecting Tanzania with Melbourne. This is not something new. It's been around since the 90s, particularly this type of technology that we're talking about, which is high voltage direct current. So it's not something absolutely new, definitely.
Yeah. The distance between Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico is 90 miles of subsea. If you compare that to the project that Rafael was mentioning, there's a project that's already in execution to bring solar power from the Sahara to the UK. That's over 1,000, I think it's like 1,500 miles. It's going to bring through that cable more power than Puerto Rico consumes. But it's feasible because you gain a significant amount of power and you gain a significant amount of reliability. This cable, in terms of how cables are built, is actually easy for the manufacturers. It's just the complexity is we're entering a new world. It's never been done in the Caribbean. It's never been done in Puerto Rico. So that's where we get all of these questions and people getting nervous. But the reality is that this is an everyday business on that side of the world.
When we were talking to the manufacturers of the cable, we told them, we're talking about, a maximum depth of 500 meters. To me, that's a lot. And they told us, well, we consider that shallow waters, so it's okay.
Shallow waters. So actually, we're a little bit pressed for time, and we could talk about this for hours. But I do want to get maybe a little bit granular on the financing, because clearly from a technical, environmental, engineering, political, that viability has been established, but ultimately none of that matters if it's not a financially viable project. Could Tirso and Rafael, can you speak a little bit to how much is this going to cost? If you have a number, what's the ticket, and how do you intend to finance this?
So this is 100% privately funded project. The project is about $1.2 billion for the cable project. Obviously, we're looking at financing through the normal markets, and I'll let Rafael talk a little bit about that. One thing that I do want to mention, though, is that we are not. This is not dependent on federal funds. This is not costing the Puerto Rican government anything. So it's not something that's going to be paid by Puerto Rican taxpayers. It's actually a self-funded and financially feasible project. And I'll let Rafael go a little bit more into the structure.
Basically, we're talking about a 70-30 structure on the cable per se, like Tirso was mentioning, and there's then there's a generation side as well. That will be like another $1.2 billion, and right now we're seeing it as a separate project. But there has been talked about actually merging both projects into one. And in both projects, we're talking about totally being privately funded and talking to multilaterals. There's some big funds that actually are extremely interested in investing, as well as even the manufacturers of the converter stations and the cables and some of the equipment. They're actually willing to invest with us as well.
So I know we've hit the mark, and now the clock turned and tells us how much we're over, not how much is remaining, but how much we're being delinquent. But let's take just a couple of minutes, maybe Eduardo, just thoughts on that you may have big picture on the project, but specifically it's been discussed for a long time. We know it's viable, but what are your thoughts on now, immediate next steps, long term? Why is it different now than perhaps when you were in the legislature and what you've seen over the last decades, and why you're so gung ho on this?
I'm gung ho because I think it will create stability to a system that doesn't have it. And I'll just finish with saying that regardless of the fact that we all try to forget about politics, we're all worried about who's going to win the next election here, who's going to win the next election in Washington, and who's going to be the next president of the Dominican Republic. So politics does play a role, and I think part of any project has to be your whole government affairs team has to actually work around, sort of navigate through that whole system. So I would say it's a great project from a financial standpoint, it's a great project from a technical standpoint, and we're still working on, and they should still be working on the whole, new challenges that could arise depending on who wins the presidency of the United States, who wins the governorship here, who is the next president of the Dominican Republic. Thank you.
Tirso, just closing remarks, and then Rafael, and then we'll wrap it up.
I think that this project, its priority is resiliency, making sure that Puerto Rico can grow its investments through, as Rafael said, without power, economies can't grow. But this project will also bring significant savings through sharing of resources. Sharing of resources is the most important thing for an energy transition.
The economies of scale that this project brings about, using an already terminal that is built in the Dominican Republic to provide energy to Puerto Rico. The fact that we'll be able to burn natural gas, U.S. natural gas, that we can't burn in Puerto Rico because of the Jones Act, that's another advantage. We'll have access to cheaper gas through this project. So there's a bunch of things that will make this project not only financially viable, that is the first thing of a project to be sustainable, is for it to be financially viable. But as you said, we're doing good and doing well at the same time.
Super. Well, wish you all the best of luck. Godspeed. Thank you all.
Guys, we've still got a couple more minutes because I'm pretty sure we're going to have some questions out here. And this is an amazing conversation on how we move Puerto Rico to the new age. And like Eduardo said, we have a power grid here on the island, which is aging and archaic. And I'm pretty sure a lot of people want to know more about this project. So I have someone with the hands up right here.
Thank you guys for doing this. I think this is a great idea. But from someone who's been on the island for only 3 years, and I drive around the island and I see wonderful windmills everywhere, none of them are turning. None of them are generating. And I look at Luma, the only electric company that can't keep the electricity on. And I think about the power generation. You're talking about thermal generation. Why haven't they done something about this where it takes you guys to connect us to another country to bring electricity? Why hasn't it happened here on the island already with the infrastructure we currently have?
Do you have 2 hours to go over this? I think there are many issues that are involved here. Puerto Rico, the electric power system is still under bankruptcy. There are still many issues that have to do with how the power company was mismanaged for over 20 years. So there's an issue with bondholders and whatnot. The infrastructure was not brought up to speed, even though the debt was there and the money was borrowed for that, but it was not used for that. So you have all this old infrastructure now in place. Third, our distribution system, which is what Luma does. I think we should blame Luma for the distribution, but not for the generation. So the generation is, again, a different subject, but even the distribution is facing right now, and the federal government has allocated over $12 billion to redo the whole distribution system, but it's facing a whole bunch of environmental issues, environmental permits. So they have not been able to deploy. I'm not making excuses for anyone. I'm just saying, if you make the list of all the issues that they're facing right now, I think there are some people who are working really hard, but it's a little harder than we think it is.
I do want to add, to go beyond your question, that when things get solved here, when all the investments get made and everything, the project is still feasible because it will allow bidirectional energy. So if the power plants, or when the power plants get built here, it will actually accelerate their return on investment by the bidirectional sharing of power. The demand curve of Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico are fully complementary. Dominican Republic is a more industrialized demand profile. Puerto Rico has a more commercial demand profile. So their peak is during the midday. Our peak here is at night. So when we have excess solar power here, we'll be able to commercialize it in Dominican Republic. When we turn on our ACs over here and their factories shut down, we'll be able to get their power for cheaper. So in terms of the project, agreeing 100% with what you said, but at least our project is viable when we solve everything.
No, I totally agree with that, but the company that I'm building, we've actually had to put into our budget our own power generation because we cannot rely on what there is.
Right.
And that, it's hard for us, it makes us more sustainable, but it adds millions of dollars to cost.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And-
Absolutely. And that's exactly what they're.
That's what we're trying to bring to the table for companies such as yours, is to not have that
Additional tax.
that additional tax. Exactly. And we'll make it more environmentally friendly because your small generator actually is dirtier than large scale stuff that has economies of scale.
Any more questions? We have one question out here with the gentleman. Oh, one in the back and then up front.
Hi, Ernesto Villarini. Thanks for the panel. Great panel. We understand that this can't be developed isolated from government, but I'd like to think there could be some sort of insulation. So some thoughts on how to managing and de-risking that political risk that is involved in developing a project like this. Thank you.
I think it has to do with a lot of with community engagement. And one of the first things that we did is we started actually meeting with the community in Mayagüez, where we think the biggest impact will be when the construction starts. And we talked not only with the mayor and community leaders over there, but also with the president of the Association of Fishermen in the West Coast. So we started with that, making them understand the project, and then we started going up the food chain, if you will, on the government side. And we have had support from the government of Puerto Rico at all levels, from the governor, from the PREP, from PREPA, and also from the Senate and Congress here, the local Congress. So it's we've had that support, and we've had it also in the Dominican Republic as well. And over there it works a little bit different. Over there, I think it goes from the top down. But we've had support from the Minister of Energy, Minister of Commerce, the President. We've been focusing on the permits and doing what has to be done, mostly with the federal government, but at the same time engaging the communities over here, because at some point, like Eduardo said, we have to obtain the permits from the Puerto Rican government as well as the Dominican government as well.
And to add to that, to protect us, we talked about elections. We had one of the biggest milestones in the federal permit process, which was the acceptance of the application deemed complete and actionable. So now we're in a stage where the permits are in the hands of the career politicians, not the politically appointed. So regardless of what happens in the elections, the process still continues. The administration has prioritized this project because of how they deem the importance of it. So what they've done is they've made sure that the career politicians understand the expedited need to approve this and to go through all the processes without cutting
Career
corners.
public servants, not career politicians.
Sorry.
That would be terrible.
Sorry,
If it was in the hands of the career politicians.
I'm an engineer, according to a piece of paper on my wall, so I don't know about that stuff. But
Can I just say something they cannot say, or they will not probably say? I mean, kid you not. I mean, there are a whole bunch of people out there who are against this project and other projects. And there will be some folks who want Puerto Rico to go back to the state-owned monopoly, especially the former labor union. There are some people who would love Puerto Rico to stay completely out of this because they sell oil, which is being consumed right now, very dirty way of producing. So, I mean, there are some naysayers out there. And I think you have to confront them and you have to face them. But there will be some fights that will have to happen. And people like you who understand the project and who can actually express, we're not asking for voices, but I think people who can actually understand the need for something like this will actually help in expressing and explaining what this is all about. So much in terms of voices out there that are saying things that have make absolutely no sense. But that's freedom of speech.
I have another question over here with the gentleman.
Hi, I'm Francisco Martorell. I'm a Georgia Tech electrical engineer, so I'd love to hear this conversation. My question is actually more about the economics. You mentioned briefly that you have a funding structure of 70-30. I'm intrigued. What's the kind of investor that you've been able to attract to this project, and to what extent is replicable for some of the transformation we could do in Puerto Rico? And net, at the end of the day, we're paying 23 cents a kilowatt hour in Puerto Rico. What do you expect is going to be the energy cost at the consumer door once you're all done?
Okay. I'm going to start with the second part of the question. So you're paying 23 cents. We had KPMG do an analysis of what the cost of electricity is for PREPA, no, for Luma. When the generation that they do, what Genera actually sells to them, as well as Ecoeléctrica, AES, and all the other utility scale power plants, as well as the solar rooftops. And it came up to be 17.5 cents. We believe that we can bring electricity from the Dominican Republic to Puerto Rico landed in Mayagüez at 14.5 cents. So that should be 3 cents difference. Nevertheless, that's not the main objective of the project. The main objective of the project is resiliency, no? And regarding investment, if you want, we can have actually a talk later on, and I'll tell you more about it.
I do have to warn, though, that the price of the electricity to the consumer will be set by Prepa Luma. So we will bring reliable baseload power.
And a judge in New York.
All right, I have one last question to wrap up the panel.
So before we move on to the next panel, in behalf of our organization, thank you for this panel. I think it's really important to shed some light on some of Puerto Rico's problems, more than that, solutions. I've been doing a lot of research and seeing that there seems to be an interest in going back to nuclear energy. Maybe this is for you, Rafa. Have there been any progress in Santo Domingo of probably bringing that integrated into the energy solutions?
Yes, there's been conversations in the Dominican Republic to install nuclear energy. Nevertheless, there's a lot of resistance, particularly from the community and from the church. The Dominican Republic does not have a separation between state and church, so the church does have a big say in the government. However, one of the requirements that the president had when we presented this project to him is that it had to be bidirectional. The cable had to be bidirectional. And the reason he said, well, you know, I don't know when today Puerto Rico needs electricity, but I don't know 20 years from now, and this is a 20-year, 30-year project, 20 years from now, it will be maybe Puerto Rico that will be providing energy, be it nuclear or be it something else, to the Dominican Republic.
Act 17 forbids nuclear energy in Puerto Rico. It was one of the things that had to be included to get votes from folks who were saying, yes, let's open the market. But there was a big security concern locally with the existing technology at the time, 5 or 6 years ago. Could that change in the future? Of course it could, but I doubt it.
All right, thank you so much. A big round of applause.